Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum, and I want to welcome you all for tonight's Artist Talk with Mr. Willie Birch, followed by a conversation with Mr. Birch and curator Aram Moshayedi. Birch's work is part of the Hammer Museum's Contemporary Collection, which we launched in 2005 to build a collection of international contemporary art made since 1960. And this March of this year, we unveiled our brand new building expansion. You probably might have seen it on your way in. And to celebrate, we decided to present works from our collection to inaugurate the new spaces. So our current exhibition is called Together in Time, and it occupies nearly all of our existing gallery spaces. It's the largest presentation of the Hammer Contemporary Collection in our museum's history. And Mr. Willie Birch's work is featured in this exhibition, and we are thrilled to have him here with us all the way from New Orleans tonight. Mr. Willie Birch was born in New Orleans, Louisiana in 1942. He received his undergraduate degree from Southern University in New Orleans and an MFA from the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore. He lived in New York City for much of the 70s and 80s and traveled the world before returning to New Orleans permanently in 1994. Mr. Birch creates paintings, drawings, and sculptures that often center on spaces and everyday objects or scenes of daily life around his New Orleans. To quote his Prospect 5 biography, they are testaments to Black life in the city and to spaces of togetherness, individuality, ritual, celebration, domesticity, creativity, labor, and rest. His work incorporates an encyclopedic knowledge of European painting, African art, and history to create a style that is entirely his own. In addition to his object-based artworks, after the devastation of Hurricane Katrina and its entirely inhumane and degrading aftermath, Birch co-founded the Porch 7th Ward Cultural Organization to preserve culture in a neighborhood in need of revitalization and revival, and it's had an enormous impact on the youth of the historic 7th Ward neighborhood in New Orleans. He also founded the Old Pryor Street Project and Community Garden, which engages local artists, youth groups, and community members in the preservation of the culture of one of the oldest African-American neighborhoods in the city. Mr. Birch's work has been exhibited at the Contemporary Arts Center in New Orleans, the New Orleans Museum of Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Studio Museum in Harlem, New York, Mass MoCA, the Tucson Museum of Art, the Nasher Museum of Art at Duke University, the Speed Museum in Lexington, Kentucky, the Hilliard Art Museum in Lafayette, Louisiana, the Museum of Contemporary Art Cleveland, the Museum of African American Art in Tampa, and the Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art in Arizona, among many, many others. His work is included in the public collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the New Orleans Museum of Art, Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, the Ogden Museum of Southern Art, and the Speed Museum, Kentucky, as well as, of course, here at the Hammer Museum. Mr. Birch has been the recipient of many awards and fellowships, including the Guggenheim Foundation, the Pollock Krasner Foundation, the Joan Mitchell Foundation, the New York State Council on the Arts, and the National Endowment of the Arts. He was named the USA Artist James Baldwin Fellow in 2014, and he's received the Governor's Award from the state of Louisiana and the Mayor's Arts Award from New Orleans. Mr. Birch's work has been included in numerous group exhibitions throughout the country, and a retrospective of his work called Celebrating Freedom, The Art of Willie Birch was organized by the Contemporary Art Center of New Orleans in 2016 and traveled nationally. So first we're going to hear an artist talk from Mr. Birch, and then we'll have a conversation with curator Aram Moshayedi, and then they'll take some audience questions. And afterwards we'll have some coffee, tea, and cookies out in the courtyard where you are welcome to come and meet the artist in person. So without further ado, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to the one and only Mr. Willie Birch. Have a great time.
Thank you. I don't know who that person was she just mentioned, but we're gonna see where this stuff goes. It was interesting today. I met this young lady who is originally from Cambodia, and she was telling me that her mother has a restaurant on Chapatula Street in New Orleans. And I said, that's the street I was born on. Chapatula's means pathway along the river. And so here I was in 1942 being born in the back of my aunt's restaurant, Thanksgiving night in 1942. So I was a family baby, and I've always been a family baby. And that story informed me to the point where today I love to tell stories because it seems sometimes like what I'm living is fantasy because of the nature of the way the world is and also growing up in the South. But yet I've been able to persevere and seem at this point to have done it to the point where now it can get recognition of people like Hammer inviting me to come and give this presentation, but also including my work in this collection. And so I feel very honored. So I want to thank the Hammer family for giving me this opportunity. Like I said, like Lady say, Claudia said, I'm from New Orleans, Louisiana, and that to me is the greatest city in the world. I know that people would take objection to that, but in terms of America's only real art form, it comes from New Orleans, and we need to remember that, and we call it jazz. And that music is about storytelling. It's not, if you know something about the history of Western art, it has nothing to do with Dada. It has nothing to do with the deconstruction of art. It's about the creation and telling of the identity of a people who were able to survive due to the fact that they were being oppressed. That's a hell of a story. And so for the first time now, America is really seemed to have decided it has to engage that part of the story in order to really tell the history of America. And that's going to be very painful sometimes, especially with people like me, because that is my role. I like to say the fact that I went to art school, a teacher of mine in the 8th grade created an art school for me. I grew up in the Magnolia Project, which is the projects in New Orleans, a single mother who had 3 babies out of wedlock. And she never wanted me to be an artist, but all these things are important and give you some information as to why I'm who I am and why I do what I do. At 18, I joined the Civil Rights Movement. These are important things. My mentor, who has a street named after her in New Orleans, named Aretha Castle Haley, sent me to the library, which we integrated to look up an artist by the name of Kathy Kolowitz. The first time yesterday I saw that bust of Kathy Kolowitz, and it just made my day. Because if you know anything about Kathy Kolowitz, she was doing things with anti-establishment, the art that she was making. So all these things have informed me. But at the same time, what Aretha said to me was that and artists have 1 foot in poverty and 1 foot in aristocracy. And they'll never give you the money because they want to keep you in poverty. But at the same time, you are the record of particularly the underserved, the marginalized. So my thrust of making sure that I keep that mandate and that trust that these people who helped me to go to school and helped pay for my college education. These little old ladies who raised and did cookie bakes so that I could become who I am, I celebrate them. So what I do is for them. So I'm telling you this because when we begin to look at the slides, what you're going to see is that a lot of the work is for me at this point, is for you, young people. I'm interested in you. You are young enough to be my grandchildren. And that's important because you are the people who are going to carry on and decide whether this stuff is relevant. Artists, we are made and disappear, and sometimes we are reborn again, like James Baldwin would say. You find something and you're able to use that information, and it says something about who you are. But this is a short trip, and memory is very short. There's a saying that I talk about a lot of times, and then I'll start showing the slides. And that is that Europeans see 100 miles as a short distance. Americans see 100 years as a short time. So what does that, or as a long time? Because, yeah, Americans see 100 years as a long time because we have such a short history. So you are going to be the carriers of whatever this stuff become in terms of defining what kind of country you want. And I believe the country is in a real shaky situation now in terms of what it want to be. But it's going to be up to all of you. And it's going to be multiracial. And the biggest thing is you're going to have to deal with these class issues, because this is where we move, and race is becoming less of an issue, folks. It's going to be about class. So I'm here to introduce you to what is to come if it's not already here. And so I hope that you listen and learn, disagree, and have free engagement as to what we all deserve as fellow human beings. But it's your journey. I will transition within the next couple of years. And being in New Orleans, we celebrate life and death. We give them equal balance. We celebrate you when you die, and we cry for you when you're born. This is New Orleans, okay? So let me start off with this particular piece. This is what you'd call an assemblage or whatever. It was done after Martin Luther King was killed in 1968, and it's called Two Faces of a Nation. And I'll give you a short history of this, and then you can better understand what. Now I've just given you about this whole history of Aretha Castle Haley, my mentor, and giving you an understanding of what the role of an artist is, or what I've become. And this piece, I had this professor named Arthur Britt, who I'd never seen art like this. I didn't realize I'd seen art like this. And what happened was that he took these pieces of just scrap around New Orleans, and he made this piece based on the bombing of the 4 little girls that were killed in Alabama. At that time, there was a thing called the National Conference of African American Artists, or Colored Artists, and that show was held in Atlanta, Georgia. And you had people like Charles White. You had people like Elizabeth Catlett. You had people like Jack Jordan. You had people like Hale Woodruff. You had some of our most prominent artists who, as far as I know, had never done anything in relationship to making money. It was all about making sure that they made imagery that was reflective of their time. And that is what they did in terms of the people that they served, which were people of color. So that piece that Dr. Arthur Britt made won first prize over Elizabeth Catlett, who we know is a great sculptor, over Jack Jordan. And all of a sudden I had to rechange my direction as to what was precious. These scraps of just little fragments, they just were discarded things that we threw away, but all of a sudden they have another purpose because there is metaphor, there's all these different ways of interpreting them, and eventually they come out to something I want to say about America, which is that we live in 2 different countries. We live in the country that I live in, and we live in the country that other people who happen to be of a lighter hue do not understand, or does not appreciate, or does not know anything about. So I just wanted to start with that. This is another one of those pieces, which is called The Door. And again, we're showing this because you're going to see some replica of this in another form as I move through my 40, 50 years of making this stuff. Okay, I go to graduate school, and I want to understand abstraction. Uh, I had a problem with abstraction because the people I come out of, they didn't understand, or they wanted a more literal interpretation of so-called abstract work. But the meaning is there, but you have to have a history of it. You have to have the knowledge of it, as you all know probably, in terms of you have to have a history of American art. And so it may be esoteric to some people, but to those with the tutored eye, they understand all of those layers of meaning underneath that. Well, most black people, we don't work like that. That's why we do figurative stuff. So the only route to me making the art that I went to Maryland Institute to learn about was to make these paintings dealing with the map of Africa. That was my desperation, because that was the closest thing I could find that would make an image that I could recognize and take someplace else in terms of being within the same genre as, say, a Morris Louis or a Sam Gilliam, or whatever that we call the Washington Color School. These paintings are fairly large, like 7 by 8. And so now I'm beginning to understand something about social art, social commentary, all of those things, but yet within this abstract way. But eventually I got bored with this. And what I learned from my musician friends in New Orleans, the ones I really admire, is that you can play different ways, the same tune or different tunes, but the reality is that you don't have to stay and do the same thing for the rest of your life. So as young artists, since this is not about making money, once you solve a problem or solve or conquer the way you want to make something, then the best thing you could do, if you're really going to be involved in this that has some spirit, you move on to another form that also gives you this energy, because this process is a constantly changing process. And as we would say coming out of New Orleans, we are making living art. We're not interested in dead art. That's been made. We're interested in living. Okay, I got this commission because I studied also sculpture, and they told me I was very good at it. So I got this commission from the oldest Catholic church in Baltimore, and the priest asked me to do a life-size crucifix because they wanted the parishioners to feel something about themselves in terms of, if you study Renaissance, we know that Christ, the person we call Jesus Christ, he had kinky hair, and he was of a darker hue. But when you look at Renaissance art coming out of Italy, sometimes he's depicted as somebody with blonde hair. Well, you realize people make things that represent themselves, that they can feel close to. So, but for me, I wanted to do a self-portrait that had some semblance of myself. Now, I become artist in residence at Studio Museum, and I wanted to do a voodoo series. So what happened, and I was surprised to get this honor to be artist in residence at Studio Museum, because I just didn't think that my work really fit into what Studio Museum was looking for. Studio Museum, which is now a historically known black institution, were interested in making art that was more representative of what was going on within the larger community. And to me, that basically meant that I would have to give up my blackness. I would have to give up for something else, as Thelma Golden would say. But that's not realistic in terms of who I am. So anyway, Studio Museum got me a Xerox machine. I asked for a Xerox machine, and I made these large pieces based on that, because voodoo is different than voodoo. It's different. It's an amalgamation of different African religions coming out of Europe, and in New Orleans, it's also about Catholicism. And what it is, it's a hybrid that's really very much involved in everything we do in New Orleans, which defines how we do it and why we do it. We are ancestor worshipers. And I work in series, so there may be 40 pieces in this series. Okay, everything is series. Okay, after that, I did these. I started looking at people, and I'm in New York now too. I'm looking at people, particularly people of color, and they look like all faces of all the African people, all the African faces I've seen. So I started taking friends of mine or whoever I could find, and I would do this basically something based on one of the traditional African masks and interject the person. So I made this portrait series, and because although I'm in New York, I always was projecting back to New Orleans in terms of what I did. So I never felt real comfortable there. I felt comfortable with what I was doing, but it felt sometimes like you out there by yourself. Okay, I did a after that series, I did what's called a solid state series. These three I'm showing you were in the show at the Museum of Modern Art about 2 months ago. And like I get in trouble sometimes. I used to get in trouble with the art community. And what happened is that you get put out of the club. And so I had to create out of this very small studio. I had this television. The name of the television was Solid State. You know, I don't know what the overall brand was, but it was, this particular brand was Solid State. So I'm looking at these images that coming out of something that says Solid State, which is a contradiction to the type of imageries I'm looking at. I think this was at the Emmett Till's funeral. And then there was Gandhi. And the other thing is what's unique about most of these pieces that they're usually on something that's blue, like a blue chair. Blue becomes a metaphor for the blues. These things become ways of giving another layer to meaning so that as you move from one part to the other, there are other things in here that will grab you. There's also a numerology going on, which I chose the number 3 because of my relationship with Egypt. So if you start looking and you start counting, you will look at these pieces over and over and over again, and what you saw the first time, you may not see the second time. That sounds just like the music that we create. Okay, I'm constantly going back to just doing whatever I do because I don't follow the rules that have been set up that you do one thing and you continue to do this. I had problems eating watermelon as a child because all of the images I saw were based on this negative way of looking at watermelon. And in 1962, because of the civil rights movement, I was forced to join the Air Force to get away from the United States. And I wound up in Europe. And it was dangerous stuff that I was doing, or the type of duty I was doing. But there was this picnic, and I'm the only African American among these fellow GIs. And somebody brought up a truck of watermelon, and I never saw white people eat watermelon like that in my life. And I'm standing on the sideline looking at this because I've been denying something that they have made me feel that I shouldn't enjoy the pleasure of. So this piece became a break from the revolution as I eat this piece of watermelon. The other thing is that, yeah, all of it has all of that humor in it. The other thing is that I'm using wood that I'm finding on the streets, which is, we like to think of found objects, but if we study African art, we know that the master carver would go into the woods till he finds something, or it could be in stone or what, but the point is that is what they would carve out of. So the idea of found objects, I'm not sure what that is. All I know is that it represents a form that I can make something out of, whether it's called a ready-made or whether it's called just an unusual block of wood that has a history and a character that allows me to release whatever is inside of it. Okay. Now, again, this is another body of work. There are 36 pieces in this series. They're all wood carvings of pieces that I found on the streets of Brooklyn and New York. I would drag them home and drag them over my studio, and I began to do these carvings. This particular piece, which I'm going to show you, is called Voices from the Belly of the Earth. One thing I found about me that was different from a lot of my New York African-American artist friends was that I always wanted to know something about Africa, and I always wanted Africa to be a part of what I did. Some of them I felt were trying to get away from Africa, because in order to fit into another structure. But for me, Africa was very, very important. And also I began to hang with Latinos, like Puerto Ricans and Dominicans and Cubanos, because if you look at the genesis of their work, they never abandoned Africa. Africa is an integral part when you look at their music, when you look at their dance, when you look at every part of who they are. And of course, that's also New Orleans, because New Orleans is the most Caribbean city on this hemisphere. So I'm finding all of these pieces of wood, big, small, and I'm doing these pieces, and eventually this is what happens. And the name of the piece they go from, and it's an installation because it goes from the floor and they fly. Okay, this is a piece called Passages, and I'm looking at a lot of stuff now that are coming out in these galleries, which are very interesting because I've been doing this stuff. This thing here was done in, 1985? So I'm looking at forms that I like to think that I created. And I'm watching what young artists are doing. I'm saying, wow, brothers, so I see why y'all know me. But I don't know you, but it's now I'm saying, I'm joining with you. And I like to feel that, hey, there is an energy there and a synergy there that you are embracing. And I just happen to be the old man in the room right now. This piece called Passages. Then I was talking to Aram today, and we were talking about my folkloric series. And what had happened was that this was in the late 80s, where there was a debate because there were all of these self-trained artists who were beginning to get recognition. And then there was a lot of African artists who were beginning to come to the forefront, and they were trying to put the work in as pop art or what, but it was their own invention. But in terms of me, I'm looking at this debate because a lot of my academically trained African-American artists were jealous because the people who were getting the recognition were the self-trained artists, and here they had studied this stuff all their life, but now America was looking for something new. And my contention on that was that the energy is in the self-trained. And that's why people gravitate to it. Because if we deal with it from an academic point of view, there's something about that it becomes redundant. And the artist is supposed to always be searching for the new. That's what we do. That's why you search and you struggle through this process, because you are searching for something that you cannot put your hands on, but when you find it, you feel it. That's New Orleans again. This piece was for Nelson Mandela. Okay, this is the piece in your collection which I haven't seen in years, and then my gallery in New York showed it. And I was looking at it today, and when you first see it, it looks very different than the rest of the stuff in the show. But then if you know the history of the layers, and how do we look at beauty? How do we look at all of these things which I'm questioning and looking at? You begin to understand that this piece is more rich than just somebody who is primitive or don't have any academic training. And I got into it with a couple of my friends who knew about my background. But at the same time, this is in New York, and New York can be very anti-self-trained. New York has this idea of I guess, supposed to consider itself very sophisticated in somewhat. And here I am saying I can take everything you got, put it within this other context, and you still can't reject it for what it is. Okay, this is an interesting piece that's on Martin Luther King Day. There was a riot in Miami, and the name of this piece is Martin Luther King, McDonald's, and Miami's Burning. And what had happened was that McDonald's had put an ad out that said, "Do Nothing Day." So of course I want to record that. Now, I thought the piece was great enough to be bought years ago. So we still have it. So that lets you know that everything that supposedly is good does not see the light of day, maybe for years, because it's just too close. And maybe you're adding a layer to it that the rest of the people aren't just not comfortable with. This is papier-mâché. I went to New Orleans and I saw a 15th century Spanish papier-mâché crucifix. That let me know I could do papier-mâché, but also New Orleans has a papier-mâché tradition within the carnival floats. The idea of precious. We'll see. What makes it precious? What makes it precious is something that you feel gives you some idea of your survival and makes you feel good about it. It could be a coin. So this idea of precious, and here I'm using something that's sent away to India, something to be refined and sent back to the United States as sellable paper. And then I'm saying, I'm putting a price on it and saying, if you want it, this is what you have to pay for it, which challenges the whole idea of canvas and precious metals and all of these things. I'm taking the whole thing on to try to make sense of how do we see ourselves and how do we see what's been discarded in terms of its preciousness and beauty. Okay, this piece here is called The Couple. Because it deals with miscegenation. It was supposed to be in a show in Virginia. And the show, and a group of us were commissioned to do these pieces. But what happened eventually was that the show was canceled because I don't think the people like what was being said by certain artists in the show. The idea was that, I don't know if you know it, but George Washington sired at least 100 babies of color. All of this is documented. So as somebody who also is very interested in history, all I had to do was study this stuff and then find a way to make something out of it that represented whatever all of those issues are around the idea of interracial relationships in this particular situation. This is a piece called Going Home. The people who bought it wanted me to change the name to Going South. They almost didn't buy it because I refused to change the name. Eventually they did buy it. There's a numerology all here in terms of the 3 suitcases, but also in the mother, the child, and the doll. All of these things. So there's a rhythm that's within these pieces that you respond to not just on a 3-dimensional level, but you also respond to them on a 2-dimensional level as if they're paintings. This is a group of clothes. I did a Nairobi series in Nairobi, got in trouble. But this piece is called The Worker and the Boss. And it's a humorous story because the worker had stolen some of the boss's chickens. And I'm listening to these 2 argue. So, and the worker would say, "No, boss, I didn't steal them." But we knew that he had. And the idea of that exchange between the laborer and the owner, and that goes on beyond race and class, and it goes on all over the world. This piece is called, it's called For the Mau Maus. It has Kenya on it, but I don't know if you know about the Mau Maus. The Mau Maus were the people who integrated, who took down the colonial power called England and became liberated before the civil rights movement in America, because this was done in the early 60s. Now, what makes these figures important to me, these twin figures, and that is they all had dreadlocks. I met these old men in Kenya, and they have dreadlocks. Well, where did they get this idea to, as their social commentary, to put dreadlocks on their head? Well, okay, folks, I've been to Egypt, spent my whole grant one year, $5,000 from National Endowment, and went to Egypt for 5 weeks. And in the third floor, and I can tell you, and I hope some of you go to Egypt, go to Cairo, and you go on the third floor, I don't know if it's still there, but there's Tutankhamun's hair. What do you think Tutankhamun's look like? Tutankhamun's hair are dreadlocks. Okay? Now, so what happens? The Mau Mau takes that from Tutankhamun, and then what happened? We get to Jamaica. What does the Rastafarians do? They take from the Mau Maus and they do dreadlock. So now you got a proliferation of people who are dealing with the hair and the textures and the kinkiness and all that stuff, and we got a whole new form as it moves from one people to the other and one generation to the other that expresses something about them and their humanity. The bottle tops are called Tuskabir. Tuskabir is the elephant. The elephant is probably one of the most powerful, or the most powerful animal in the world. So the elephant becomes the strength within this piece. So there's metaphor in all of these pieces on that level. Okay, this is part of my dialogue series, which this piece here is done with the idea of the comedian and humor. So it's like listening to radio or listening to television, and you just jotting down all of these different layers. And they have an energy about it. And the play is that how do you mix these things up where you tell the story using words and imagery that still speaks to in this case, my reality, and at the same time speak to the history of African Americans. Okay, this is a piece that I really love this piece because I'm listening to the radio, and this little lady of European origin, she's on radio talking to this black sister. They're having this conversation. And what are they talking about? They're talking about diversity. I can't make this stuff up. And it's all based on documentary. It's a real thing. So I'm sure somewhere if you look for it, you could find somebody giving this conversation. This is, I'm showing this because this is my second commission. How many people have gone to Schönberg? How many people know what a Schönberg is? The Schönberg is the archives of black history in America. That's in Harlem. Well, I happened to get that commission, and I was commissioned to do this piece on what this represents. On one side of the street is Harlem Hospital, and the other side is the Schönberg. And the Schönberg is an important institution. Matter of fact, it's more important to me than I believe the Studio Museum at this point. This is this church that was bombed in North Carolina by the Klan, and I got an architectural rendering of it some kind of way, and I did this, and I make an Nkisi out of it. How many people know what an Nkisi is? If you know something about certain types of sculpture, in terms of African sculpture, there is a chest cavity, and within that is the energy within the piece. So what I'm doing, I'm putting bells, I'm putting oyster shells. These are indigenous to New Orleans. So all of these, oyster shells can be amulets. They can be like cowrie shells. But I'm using indigenous things that pertain to my experience, but they serve the same purpose. This is a piece for, I decided to try doing something, now this, it's blue somewhat, but again, this is for Sidney Bechet. How many people know who Sidney Bechet is? Again, All these things are historical in dynamics. And it's called a blues for the Bichets. And the Bichets, outside of Louis Armstrong, Sidney Bechet is probably one of the historically best known musicians. He played clarinet, and you've heard him all your life. You just didn't know who he was. This is when cotton was king, and I went and found out what the sizes of most of these sacks were, and I did a whole narrative piece on this whole idea of cotton. Now, after that, I began to run out of energy in terms of wanting to do paper mache, and I began to, I'm really in New Orleans full time now. And I realized I want to do something different. I want to challenge the idea of New Orleans aesthetic, because our aesthetics is based on, has been decided that it's about color. And I'm saying, people were calling me a colorist. Well, okay, I want to challenge that whole idea. And I started doing pieces like this. And also they showed other skills that people didn't know I had, or they didn't believe I had. And all of these people are just people in my neighborhood in New Orleans. Then I began to do these black and white pieces, which changed the whole trajectory. And it also messed with me economically, because my galleries wanted me to do paper mache. This piece called Bride of Jesus. This piece is called A Wedding in Congo Square. This piece is a blind man going to the Mafa ceremony. The Mafa ceremony is it leads to the Mississippi River to throw flowers in the river to basically honor the ancestors who didn't make it. This piece is called For Ernie Cato. This is called No Tears for Ernie Cato. I had the privilege of growing up across the street from a place called the Dewdrop Inn. The Dewdrop Inn is where Ike and Tina Turner played, Big Mama Thornton, Joe Turner, Sam Cooke. All these people came to New Orleans, Alan Toussaint. And as a child, I have seen to these people making and playing their music. So Ernie Cato was one of these people, and he's a New Orleans legend. So when he died, it was one of the biggest funerals I've ever seen in New Orleans. So that taught me that it's not the politicians who get the big funerals, it's people who are revered like Ernie Cato. Okay, second line, and you can see where it is. Okay, this was from my music series. In terms of drumming in the Great Hall, these are traditional African drummers drumming in the New Orleans Museum of Art. And anybody know my history know I love to take on the museum there, because I wasn't allowed to go to that museum until I was 11 years old. And I didn't go back to it until I was 22, because it was segregated. Okay, young musician. Okay, Shout Sister Shout. These Mardi Gras Indian group called Fa Ya Ya. And this is not carnival, folks. But the ritual of the Indians, the masking tradition, is unbelievable. And to be a part of that, just the sheer energy and the magic. This is Zulu, and what I really love about this piece was the little sister who was dancing and how she's empowering herself. And I mean, she's controlling this whole space. Gesture is such a powerful medicine, and it says so much about who we are. And in New Orleans, people can appear very sexual in that gesture. We do dances where we stick our booty out. And it's a protest. It's a protest that says we can do anything we want to do. And there's songs that like, do what you wanna. And it's a protest against the establishment. That's New Orleans. This is Congo Square. This is the revolution has sold. This is just the second line. This is a wedding where I can really expand, and somebody gave me enough money to frame them the way I want to, but it's jumping the broom. This is my family church. The old church was St. John, and the new church is the new St. John. And those are the parishioners at the bottom. The history is that the little church in the middle section was, how can I put this? It created its own school and built this church in 1862. When did slavery end? So what does that say about these people? That's powerful juju, right? Okay. In Louisiana, we have more twins born than any place in the United States, outside of Nigeria. That's still today. Okay. The piece on the right is the one, there was an incident where because of drugs, and I'm relating it to the piece that you have, young man was killed, and his father was the drug king. So when the police came and the fire department come, they're supposed to clean the streets of the blood. They didn't. I went out there and protested, and then I asked a group of friends of mine, let's do a demonstration because I want to make something out of this whole thing. So this piece called Scrubbing, it goes scrubbing, sweeping, and healing, because of the nature of the fact that they had no understanding of the preciousness of human dignity, so they did what they did. They left the blood on the ground, just like it was. Well, I can't allow that to happen just being who I am. Okay. We all know what bottle trees are. Well, I had a bottle yard. I had a bottle fence. Okay. This tree is the tree in my family cemetery. There was this metal gate that was growing inside the tree to let you know how old the tree was. Okay. Fences again, and you can relate back to the second piece where you saw the doorknob with the constructive piece, but. Gates, fences, what are they for? They're barriers that keep you out or keep you in. All these things are constantly being played out in my work. Okay, the veves that are on the metalwork of this person's house. If you go, how many people know what a peristyle is? They know what they've seen Haitian veve or voodoo veves. This is pervasive throughout New Orleans. New Orleans, you could tell who was there when they came. The St. Louis Cathedral, they have these diamond shapes. These diamond shapes, you go to New Orleans, people say, well, those diamond shapes, oh, they're beautiful the way what y'all do with them. The reality is that they celebrate freedom because they mean crossroads of life. So the Africans who came there were doing things to teach the future generation how to get ourselves from underneath the yoke of this oppressive system. Now, the flowers are very interesting because they're bell flowers. They're poisonous. So anybody that knows that, you look at this very different, but yet it's a very beautiful piece. Now, this is an interesting piece because I became artist in resident for NOCA, which is the high school of performance art and visual and dance, music, whatever. And they asked me to do a residency, and I told them I didn't want to do a traditional residency. I wanted to take the kids out of the studio space and take them use this space, which is plessy. How many people heard of homoplessy? How many people heard of separate but equal? Okay, this took place right there in New Orleans. And so the train station is right across the street from here where he got on the train and was arrested. Okay, so you'll see what happened better than me telling you. Memorial. Memorial for homoplexy. You understand? This is making art. This is making art out of what's there. Understanding that you're in a certain environment, and so what can you do with that? And so you come up with things like this, which those kids will never be the same. Because now they realize they don't have enough, they don't have to have all the money, they don't have all these materials they need. They can find a way and find materials that speak to whatever they want to do. And because creativity is a natural extension of who you are. So you don't have to deal with somebody else's rules in terms of how you create. You just have to trust that what you're going to do is valid first just for you. Now, this is there are these things called crawfish or crayfish, and I wanted to do something on that because crayfish, after Katrina, these things just would bubble up out of the earth. In my backyard at the time just had all of these crawfish mounds all over it. And I said, wow, but that was due to Katrina, because if you dig down 3 feet in the ground in New Orleans, you're going to hit water. So we have water running all under that. And so I decided to cast these mud little objects. And they started with casting paper. Then they went to bronze. Okay, so I decided I wanted to go a step further. I got one of the people who understands New Orleans, but also is willing to give me the money I need to do this. Boom. Okay. Yeah. And it's called Homeboy. Okay. Just everyday objects. Come back to watermelon. Who stole my watermelon? Just the simple object of what's the thing? Fire detector. You can make art out of anything. This cross was the Union cross in my family cemetery because we had black Union soldiers that were buried. So in New Orleans, I have all of this history, and I can go to it or I can see it and experience it and decide I want to do something about it, and it always can transcend into something else that allows you, the viewer, to come in and participate in possibilities that you wouldn't experience unless somebody decided that this was valid for making art out of. We all have seen this. This is an interesting piece because it's cotton growing in a bucket. And the house that this was at was my neighbor on Villeray Street, and those who know my old neighborhood. He was a mechanic, and he would plant these cotton bulbs every year because the kids who walked home from school would see they'd never seen, we don't see cotton, we only see it in terms of shirts and material. And here it was, this was cotton growing on a cotton bush. And anybody have ever touched it, it sticks, it's hard work. But the key beyond that for me was that it was against the law then, and it's still against the law for any individual to plant cotton in Louisiana. I don't know about the rest of the South. I know in Louisiana. So that lets you know that if you do this, you can go to jail. This is a dead possum. Isn't that beautiful? You know? Yeah, dead, and think about it, dead possum. You've seen people play, they play dead, you know. So you got all of those connotations added to it in terms of us as human beings. Okay, this is an interesting piece because the flags are, this is Patriot Day, but the flags are all, the flag is backwards. so, so I don't know how many people, this was, and here was my neighbor who was very patriot, and his father was in the military, but when he put up his decorations for July the 4th or whatever that year, he put the flags up backwards. So I just loved it because of what it said. Okay, it's called Three Rooms. This is still part of my worker series. We had this big hole in the ground and it's just slewing all of this water and stuff. And they're two pieces. So, okay, this is the builders, part of the builders. This is an interesting piece because Carol Walker came to town to do her piece in Algiers, and she did this beautiful piece. But when I was going to Algiers, this ship called the Trader was going out to the Gulf. Now, anybody who knows what Algiers is in New Orleans, Algiers is where when they brought the enslaved people to the New Orleans area, they kept them across the river there in Algiers. So now here I'm experiencing this ship called the Trader. So the contradictions are always the metaphors, and just trying to give you some few to think about. Now it's oil now. Okay. And this was the show, the 300-year show I had at NOMA. I think I had 53 pieces in this show. Playing with man-made materials like, paint, and also playing with natural fibers. The piece in the broken wheelbarrow is called Gathering of the Bones. The piece that you see across from Playing in Time, matter of fact, the piece Playing in Times was sold by somebody here in Los Angeles. They sold it at the big Basel thing. But the other piece across from it is called 5 Lines and 4 Spaces. Okay, so I'm leading you to this piece, this other piece in a minute. Here we go. The back piece there is called For Generations Not Yet Born. That's why I talked about it earlier, because this piece for you folks, the largest slave revolt in the history of America, guess where it took place? In Louisiana. And the people did not make it to the mint where these African people and these white, because it wasn't just black people, the whites who joined, mostly Irish, they did not make it to the mint, which is in New Orleans. That's the armory. And when Jefferson understood what these people were doing, he said that if the rest of the world knew what these black folks were trying to do, we'd all be in trouble, because that's where the mouth of the Mississippi is. And if these folks had made it and taken over and put a blockade at the mouth of the Mississippi, it'd be a totally different country now. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah, this is an interesting piece. It's called Waiting for a Serious Conversation About the South. And I can go on about the controversy with this piece. And it was about how much you're going to pay me for it. Yeah. This piece is called, what's it called? It's called Everything's for Sale. We understand what all that's about. Okay, you know, somebody is selling their clothes and all of this outside. But it also takes on this contemporary meaning, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of art making. How do we value what we do? How do we make social commentary in that whole process? Okay, there are three pieces to this. There are white picket fences, and all the houses are within like a triangle. This is, it's two slides, but really one should be above the other, but we didn't have a chance to put this right. So it's the Denzanga Bridge and the Mississippi Ridge. And during Katrina, black folks weren't allowed to go over this bridge or go over the Mississippi Bridge. So we were stuck in the city. You hear me? Okay? And people died. Okay, this piece was for Jacob Lawrence. It's still for Jacob Lawrence. It's in the Minneapolis Contemporary Museum. And again, it deals with, when Jake came to New Orleans, because he visited New Orleans quite a few times, he wound up doing a whole series called the Worker Series. And those of us who are astute and understand the history of somebody like, I think the most important African-American artist in the United States, Jake would see these workers and he would do this whole body of work on it. Well, when I saw the series, I was always impressed with it. But then when I understood what inspired him to do it, well, of course, then I got to have a dialogue with him, because that's what I'm doing. I'm having dialogues. This is the way we build, where you see families. That's 1, 2, 3, that's five families of the same family, because this is what people do who don't have much money. The similar thing to this that really attracted me was that when I was in Egypt, and people build the same way. They build a building, and then when one of the children get married, they add on. Another children marry, they add on, and you get these incredible compounds in terms of building. So I didn't know that we in New Orleans had a relationship to that, so I started looking at houses like this. Now, this is my project that I'm still working on right now, and I want you to see it. And if anybody think I'm spending too much time, let me know, because I'll just run through them. But this is this garden that I've built and used. The name of this project is Using Art in the Transformation of a Community. It was a drug-infested, horrible neighborhood, and I bought the property, and people say, well, you trying to gentrify? I say, no, what we want to do is keep the people that are here, but what we're going to do, we're going to use our art-making process. So I commissioned 5 artists to do pieces, and we built this garden, and one of the first things we did was we found out who lived in the neighborhood, who were long gone in terms of ancestry, and we made these plaques. I think in this situation we have 36 plaques all around this white picket fence. I'm sure we know that what the symbology of the white picket fence is in terms of prosperity, in terms of America, and that you made it. And what became fascinating was that not only on Mardi Gras did the Mardi Gras Indians come and pay homage to these people, because a lot of them were their ancestors, but the people who knew these families, they also came and would put flowers, just like they'd go to grave and put flowers. So that made the garden sacred. The text in the back on the wall, you're going to get another picture of it. I have this Croatian friend, and I think his mother is Catholic and his father is Muslim. So he understands something about being caught in a conflict which has nothing to do with his humanness. So when I saw this piece by him, I said, Raiko, I want you to put this on my wall, because black folks keep thinking that this is about race. It's not about race, man. This is about the way we see people and how we marginalize people. The sculpture is a friend of mine. She was the first person I commissioned, and I saw a similar piece like this in another place, and I asked her if she would do one of her mound pieces. And the first response first of all, people were saying, what is this stuff? we don't know what this stuff. And I said, well, what does it look like to you? And they would go on. I said, and then they said, what, it looks like mountains, look like clouds. I said, now you get, I said, it could be anything you want it to be. Now, if I was to remove this piece, I'm sure I'd have to fight but what it did, it opened up a dialogue in terms of allowing these people to understand that whatever they thought, a thought process, it was not limited to somebody else's concept, that they can open up their own mind and do what they do. A part of it is flowers for the living. At a certain time of the year, what's going to happen is that morning glories will take over all of the flowers for the living. That's the lady named Mary. She's like the queen mama of the neighborhood. And you're going to see what happens with her in terms of I hired her to paint the fence. And that also meant that this is another yard I have when we made this altar, dealing with, the senseless killing of children. And people began to understand that this junk that was coming from the houses, coming underneath these houses that people had thrown away for years and bottles they had thrown, now was being used beyond that. This piece, you can see it on the fence, called Spirits. It's just sweetgrass. We're getting ready to do a larger piece on this, but it's going to be a two-dimensional piece. Now, remember the fence, the bench there? We'll see, see what's happening. Okay, this is 4 houses. This is my fence, become a bottle fence, become yard art, as we call it in the South. This is, and all the wood is found. Democracy under attack, and the other one deals with Black Lives Matter. And I'll come back to talk. The painting here, I'm sure some people look at it and they go, oh man, this is a beautiful abstract painting, but it has nothing to do with abstraction. Those are clovers, street, and the person who I did this 2-person show with, named Tina Freeman, a photographer, we were looking for something to ground this show in, because her work she doesn't use storytelling like I do. It's very different. It's coming out of her particular language. But for me, we call this In Search of 4-Leaf Clovers. This piece called Spring. Just the Y's, the crosses, all of these things. And this is right after COVID, where it was Mardi Gras Day, and I could look down the street and I didn't see anybody. I didn't see any Mardi Gras Indian. This was the way my community looked. Mardi Gras Day 2020. And that's not New Orleans. Back to my roofers. This piece here is called We Are Always in Survival Mode, Another Fallen Man. That's Mary, who you saw in the photograph, using this medicinal garden, because one of our beds is medicinal, and there she is painting the fence, which gave her and the community ownership. So who's going to violate that when the queen mom of the neighborhood paints the fence? It takes on a whole nother significance in terms of community building. This piece it deals with vandalism of two who are victimized through the brutality of distorting these 2 fences. Why would somebody do this, is the question that I'm asking. This one is one of my favorite. This is a tattered quilt. looking at, we know what African American quilt making is about, and we realize that, to me, it's no more than a collage in terms of taking all of these little pieces of tather that we throw away, and then we put within another construct, but it's a narrative. It tells a story about the human condition. It tells a story about who we are. Well, I wanted to do it in black and white. And so this will come up because that old quilt, somebody was going to throw it away, or attempt to throw it away. And it's tattered. So that gives it another level of dealing with, again, the human condition. Okay, this piece is called, what's it called? It's called Sunflowers for Ukraine. This is the Roofers, one of my latest pieces. Again, changing the whole idea of how do you make art, but yet putting it within, there's a perspective there, using the idea of 3 different panels that are very similar in what, as if they're like using a down jut in terms of his wall pieces, but at the same time, they're telling a narrative about my community and what happens when you get to, like, getting to the top of the mountain. This is one of my latest pieces, 12 feet, and it's called Happy Birthday, and in parentheses, we celebrate you, and there's this old lady at the bottom here. It's her birthday, and the whole community came together, and it's like carnival to see these people dancing and booging and stuff, and celebrating this old lady, which is beautiful. Okay, this piece has another history which deals with the idea of the 1811 revolt, because once the reenactment members made it to the Mint, they went in this catharsis, boy, and people were crying and stuff. And people were saying, what's that about? I said, because our ancestors didn't make it to the Mint. They were beheaded. But here we are today, symbolizing that, and that has incredible significance. Well, that wasn't the reason why I did the piece. I did the piece because the person who did this reenactment, he didn't understand that, so he went and took the thing to what we call Congo Square, which has nothing to do with this particular celebration of that moment. So, but he's not from New Orleans. Okay, this is my sister. I've done this in the last 3 months. It's called Transitioning. And the fascinating thing is that she and I talked about me doing this piece, but the fascinating thing to me was that her bedroom, you look down from her bedroom, that's a cemetery back there. And then what on her pillow? Dinosaurs. Now, I can't make this up. So I looked at her and said, Maxine, I said, look, babe, I want to do this. And I've done many pieces of my sister. So she gave me this smile, she got her hands, and she's at peace with herself, and she's ready to leave here. She's ready to go. And all of a sudden she shook her head. I took the shots, and I waited till she died, and then I did the piece. And the piece was cleansing for me because I didn't realize I could grieve that much. So it was a real catharsis to even do. It was a hard piece to do because I wanted to get it right, but I also realized that I will never hear my sister's voice again. So that means that, and she's it. I'm the only one left of those Birches. So, except my kids. So this is my sister, and we call people like this shack bully. That means they run the whole place. They run the whole family, boy. My sister was tough. So this piece deals with the history of what's the purpose, what the tourists, it's deal with the tourists who comes to the Mississippi and they look out and they see the river and they see the St. Louis Cathedral. What is the relationship between the St. Louis Cathedral and the Mississippi River in relationship to New Orleans? Well, the church sanctioned slavery, and the river was the passageway. So This place was a natural throughway to contain his idea of slavery. And if it wasn't for St. Louis Cathedral, slavery could have been ended a long time ago. But they made a contract with the French and Spanish government at that time that if you bring these slaves in, we will, and we make them Catholic, they will remain slaves, but you can have your force that will help you to build this new world. Cynical, isn't it? But real. Okay, this piece here deals with it's interior, exterior. It's called Memories. It has a lot to do with that coconut, which comes out of Zulu. And if you ever go to New Orleans, you'll understand something about Zulu and the fact of when you go to South Africa or something, how black people turn the tables and tell stories on whoever the oppressor is. But the oppressor think that they're telling a story about themselves. So and that's what Louis Armstrong was King Zulu for. So we need to understand. Now, if you remember that this is dealing with the bench. What bench are we talking about? We're talking about the bench of the Supreme Court. See, it's like there were, I can't remember the name of the artist who painted flowers. I think it was the 15th century, but it was the same thing. And you watch the flowers die, but he was speaking about the ills of society because that's what he felt he can get away with and still speak the truth to the power structure. So artists are not doing, I'm not doing anything that hasn't been done before. So this piece is called White Bench with Clapboard Siding, Toucans, and Invasive Wild Flowers. And this is the last piece. It's called View from Inside My Studio with Self-Portrait. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I want to welcome to the stage Aram Moshayedi, who is a curator of the Hammer Museum's current Together in Time exhibition, and he's going to have a dialogue with Mr. Birch. And then I want to remind you we have coffee, tea, and cookies, and you can meet Mr. Birch in person after the program.
Okay. Thank you, Claudia.
Thanks for coming, people.
Thank you, Mr. Birch.
Thank you.
It's really amazing that you made the journey here for this talk. And I wanted to start by asking you a question of something that, it's a question actually that I read that you've often asked yourself. Mm-hmm. And it's in regard to New Orleans and your relationship to New Orleans. You said in a recent interview, you said you asked yourself often, if this place existed to create jazz, then what can I bring to the table that can rival that visually? Yeah. And especially, I think, after looking at the arc of your work from 1968 to the present, how you might answer that question. And maybe, I think for those in the audience, you started with the question of jazz in relationship to your work, but how you see yourself even moving through it visually.
I still see myself, if I could be modest, I still see myself on that journey. Because it's not me who will determine the relevance of what I do, it's you. So that's the main thing. But in terms of what the music has taught us and is this natural extension of storytelling and telling the history of particularly African American people in that part of in New Orleans in particular, but it turned out in the world, and how that has transitioned to this next level where you get the blues. The blues is before that, but eventually where we got hip hop. It's all the same stuff. It's all the same. And it's a beautiful journey when you begin to make these connections. I was talking to somebody earlier who was talking about, he brought up one of the Beatles. And I said, yeah, if Muddy Waters hadn't gone to England, We may have never heard of the Beatles. And he just said, ooh. I said, also there was a brother who sung just like Elvis Presley, except it was Elvis Presley who sung like him. So when you know these things historical, you can flip them. That's what the artists do. We flip them. And then you have to think about it. And for me, my thing is to constantly challenge you to make a lie out of me. And what happens if you find out I know what I'm talking about? See, now that's the mischievous part. That's little Willie Birch who, at 4 years old, challenged the policeman, the sheriff, who called my grandmother Kitty. And I said, my grandmother is Miss Kitty. And he came into our yard in Bertrandville. And I did not know who he was. And I was telling Aram this story today. And what happens is that he looks at me and my grandmother and says, see that one? He's trouble. So the night my uncle and my mother came in my uncle's car and put me in the back of the car and took me back to New Orleans. And I didn't go to Bertrandville for a couple of years. So that's just part of the story. Somebody was writing an article on me, and I'm telling him, I said, man, I know part of this story, but I don't know all of it, in terms of, I remember being in Bertrandville, and I told this dude, like my grandmother was Miss Kitty, but I don't know anymore. So I said, maybe you go ask my sister what happened. She could tell you. He goes, and then he come back, he said, Willie, you know who that dude was that you told to call your grandmother Miss Kitty? That was the sheriff. So right there, my family realized that they had to protect me. But it still was part of how they trained me. I became the outspoken one in the family. So this is passed on. There's somebody in everybody's family who will be the one, who will be the self-righteous one and call everybody to attention. That was my sister. And me, I do it in terms of my art. So that is but it carries that same progression. So in terms of, and the music does the same thing. From Buddy Bolden, how many people have ever heard of Buddy Bolden? See, before there was a Louis Armstrong and all that, there was a dude named Buddy Bolden. If you look in my book called Celebrating Freedom, there's a bed for Buddy Bolden. Buddy Bolden died in insane asylum because people weren't ready for what he was doing. But that sound, that you hear Louis Armstrong, you say, can he get to that note? That wasn't started by him. That was started by Buddy Bolden. So we need to study our history, and we are at a different point in America, too. We are not a very well-read people, and there are reasons for that. Well, fortunately, I am a pretty well-read person. So I'm challenging you to read. If I can keep you ignorant, I can take you anywhere I want to take you. This is what's happening now. This is why you think they're banning books. See, it all goes back to the same thing. If somebody, you look at somebody like Frederick Douglass, who learned to read, and that lady who taught him how to read didn't know how dangerous that would make him. So we need to understand, people aren't ignorant if you expose them, but we are not well-read. And a lot of my European friends, they look down on Americans because we don't know a damn thing about who we are. We don't know about the suffering of Europe. We don't know how we get existentialism. We don't know how we create words like Dada. We don't even understand what Impressionism was. Impressionism was embraced in America, but the Europeans didn't like the idea of Impressionism. Why not? It was the Industrial Revolution. You got all this smog.
How have you, okay, I don't know where I'm going to go from this. I will say, okay, I do want to ask you this question about unlearning, like de-skilling in a way, because I've thought about it in relationship to, it's what you're talking about, and this is kind of maybe a flimsy segue, but, we talked earlier about this kind of process of of posing as a folk artist at a certain point. And in some ways, that was like after going through a kind of academic life, and then kind of unlearning that kind of history. And yet, in talking to you, a lot of these references come out, like from the history of art, for instance. And I'm just wondering, like, how you see yourself navigating that kind of art historical terrain and your place within it, because what you characterized and what we've seen tonight in the narrative of your work is that it's not fixed. There's like a constant shift that you're doing in a way, I would say, to undermine yourself maybe, or to undermine the expectations of people, to characterize your work. And so, in some ways what you're doing is you're also like defying historicization. Even in the first work you said, this is an assemblage or whatever. So you would even take away the category of assemblage, which, from like a historical standpoint, it's like, it's the only thing we have. It's like the idea that like we can, put things into certain kinds of like categories to be able to, start to understand them. But ultimately it's like always a little tenuous, and
Yeah, I agree.
so from the very beginning, you're not allowing that. So how does that relate?
I'm going to say it's going to be the shortest sentence
Perfect.
I'll make tonight. It's about survival.
Okay. I think it's that. Clearly, I talked too much in my question. I mean, but to go to this question of like the self-trained, because another thing that I've I think I've read that you've said once is that we're in some ways all artists are self-trained.
Sure, you learn.
So how would you kind of characterize that maybe in relationship to this question of survival and
Well, one thing I learned, and I learned to trust, and I'll do this way first. When I was about 5 years old, 5 or 6, I started following this parade. Didn't know it, and next thing I know, I'm 10 blocks away from my house, and I'm scared because I turn around, I don't even know the community because I've never been down Simon Boulevard that far before. But there were people in the community who knew me, and they said, see you get your little butt right back down there. So here I'm following till I get back to the projects. So there was an energy and an authenticity and a magic that was happening that allowed me to respond to it naturally. So the same thing I could say in terms of what was going on in the 80s when I began to really experience or accept something that I had been denying, which was the self-trained artists. They were the most authentic. Thornton Dowell and them were the most authentic. It was the most authentic stuff I thought was being made in America. And here, part of some of my peers were objecting because they felt that they had gone through all of this torture and academic training in so-called European institutions. And now what are y'all doing? Y'all embracing these folks who don't have any training, but what they have is something that's innate, and that is that need to create and tell a story that is the uniquely theirs, whether they deal with it consciously or unconsciously. And so I'm looking at all of that, and it's all over New Orleans. I'm looking at Mardi Gras Indians. I'm looking at all of these art forms that are just naturally there that you grow up with and you take for granted. But what it is expressing your existence and your identity as a human being. And so that's why when other people come to New Orleans, one of the first things they say, wow, man, I come here, boy, and this place makes me feel so good, And I said, but do you know the history of how it got to be that way? Do you know the history of why you can shake your booty in the street today? Because all those things were suppressed. But black folks still went out there and do what they do. Because it was the only way we can stay sane. So these things are just natural, if you trust yourself. And I like to feel that as a human being first. I learned at probably a long time ago to be myself. But the main thing was that I had people who would protect me, who would allow me to do that, like my grandmother, like my sister, like my neighbors. There were people there that pull my ear if I was going around. And that's the idea of community. That's what a community does. But we're losing all of that. Or it has the possibility of being lost. So that's why I said to you folks, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to be cardboard's copy of living and live a fantasy, or do you want to be real? And I can't answer that for you. But you got to invest something in it to get something out of it. And I think that's beautiful when I meet young people who are no longer inhibited by just being themselves. Like you can't dance a certain... I mean, you think about it. At one time when they brought these people of African descent here, and they didn't have any clothes on or for whatever reason. They were primitive. Now look at your generation. Y'all, most of y'all don't have on half the clothes. So there's a flip. There's a flip in terms of the reality. And now you can express yourself. Now you can go overboard sometime. For somebody like who's 80 years old, I'm saying, wow, come on, sister, that's too much. But the point is that it says something about who you're going to be and what you're going to be. And so these are just natural things, and that's the thing I make. And so it's about survival. Because if I didn't do it, then what would I do?
Would you say, I mean, I hope that this isn't like overly reductive, but I was also noticing this kind of like thread of observation, or this kind of like observational tendency in your work, which is so much a part of the kind of later work, especially when they become black and white. Mm-hmm. But, you know, like the 80s and thinking about like the way in which like television became a kind of mediating device for you, at least, in the way that it's depicted in your work. And I was just wondering about like, I don't know, your own relationship to television, because it's not just because of Solid State, but
it's mixed. It's mixed. The newspaper, because I got in the apartheid movement in New York, and we would demonstrate, and we would sometimes a television reporter would interview us, but we didn't say what they wanted to say. So come 6 o'clock, in terms of the civil rights movement that I was really involved in the 60s in New Orleans, we didn't see that. Boom. It was the people from Europe who came and exposed the inhumanity of that. But here in America, we were suppressing it. So then you question, what is the newspaper about? You know, and you could go to somebody who's friends of John Cage, like the Korean brother who did the television piece. Yeah, right. You know, but if you read about, and he comes from upper class, so the idea of what he was doing, he already had a natural built-in freedom on certain levels to do this. Where I think if he was poor, he probably would have been a little bit more. So class got something to do with the ability to take chances. All of these things are built into how you decide what you have the right or not have the right to do. So in the end, for somebody like me, if I don't do this, then what am I going to do? And who am I trying to satisfy? Am I trying to, like, there's, in a lot of my literature, it said, I want my mama to understand. It's important that Anna understood that she could relate to this stuff, although she may say, boy, that's dangerous stuff you're playing with. The point is that it may, and plus she had lived the same situation as I have. So you want to at least educate those people around you first, and then maybe every once in a while the rest of the world can catch up to what you're doing. But it's usually, I mean, how many years it took people to understand that Rembrandt died basically poor? See? But we know he's one of the greatest artists that ever lived. So why did he die poor? What was he doing that drove that they wouldn't pay him? He wouldn't paint the aristocracy. So money, as I talked earlier about what Aretha taught me, was that an artist has one foot in poverty and one foot in art because they need you because of what you do and how you make them feel when you're next to them. But at the same time, you're dangerous. But you have to understand that that's not a given, and you have a responsibility with that kind of power. But artists are powerful people. We are griots in other cultures. You know what a griot is, huh? See? So I dedicated my life to that at 13. And I've tried to be true ever since. And that meant sometimes you feeling out there by yourself, but you're never alone. There's always somebody who will come and validate what you're doing. But this is not an easy journey. It may seem that because I'm 80 and all this stuff, and I don't look half dead, and all this stuff,
I just keep saying you look
the
really
bottom
good.
line is that this is I mean, look how many musicians who you don't even know about. Or you don't know, and there are certain artists who died with more money than we could ever understand, but yet we don't know them.
And how much, I mean, this will be my last question maybe, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. But I mean, to that end, it's very clear that you've also taken on the responsibility of somehow mediating New Orleans. I mean, both in your work, but also in yourself. And for you, what is that like?
It's a mixed plate because I see man's inhumanity to man. Like I see sometimes young black men killing each other for whatever reason, but then I attempt to understand how did we get to that and what the position that society has put them in that believe that that's the only way they can gain whatever these false trinkets are. So if I'm able to reach one of them, and I have because I've taught kids like that, and you usually can look in their eyes when they are not dead. And I've seen kids who were in Baltimore, locked out of the system, and finally, just through travel, taking them outside of Baltimore, they were able to begin to put a face on that there were other people who live different, and some people live like they live. So why should I feel that the only place that I can ever exist is within the walls of this place? And who put me in here? That's when it gets dangerous. Because now what are you going to do about it? Maybe you can write, and we always think that everybody has to be an artist. I'm interested in writers. I'm interested in what you say. Because the writer for the last, 30, 40 years now, have dictated to a large degree what artists create. Because you have the ability to write for people who read and usually have access to money. I, fortunately for me, decided that I was going to survive regardless. But that's because I come from people who taught me that I was going to survive all this. So it's it's just my faith on that level. I can't explain it beyond that. I don't believe. I can't take credit for it. But it's like the tennis shoes hanging in. We still here.
Do we have some time for some questions? And there are ushers who will select. Just raise your hand if you have a question. I'm apparently not allowed to help this process.
I have a saying too that I give my friend, who at the time we were very close. He used to say, when we were in New York together, don't be afraid to make a fool out yourself. I don't care how ridiculous the question may sound to you at the moment. If you feel you want an answer, ask it. And sometimes it's not ridiculous at all, most of these things. They're real.
If you need a ridiculous role model, I'll be one. So, but please.
Hi, my question is for Mr. Birch. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the whole presentation. But besides your last name being Birch, when you was working with the trees and some of your sculptures, was there any particular tree, the name of a tree that you like to work with the most, that you kept finding? That's what I was interested in, the name of the trees.
I like the yellow pine. It's a hardwood, which is very interesting, but I like the way it carves, okay? I mean, when you get into oak and stuff, and there are different types of oak, there's a saying that there's something that you learn early when you're going to be a wood carver. The sharper your tools are more useful for cutting soft wood, but the duller your tools are when the wood is hard. So it's little bitty things that you learn in terms of carving that you can match the tool with what are you trying to get out of the tool. So, and you learn that. You learn it just through practice. You learn that. There's a book named by Root, R-O-K. It was my Bible to learn how to carve. And you never forget these, these different techniques. And I had a great teacher. So so everybody wanted me to be a carver then. Everybody said, well, you're a sculptor. But mine can tanker and say, no, I'm an artist. Yeah, and there's a price for that. I don't know if I answered your question.
You did. You said the yellow pine.
Yeah, yellow, yeah. Yeah, and it's hardwood to find too, but it's still out there every once in a while. I'll just never forget, whenever I.
It's sorry. Wait. Did you have a question?
I did. Welcome to LA. I refrain from using the term griot. It's a French term. I use the term jolly. You are a memory keeper, and thank you for being here. I'm going to riff a little bit because my folks cried on Christmas Day. Okay. I spent about 6 years in St. James Parish, so I relate. I was just curious. My concern was some of the social structure redefining the narratives. I see yourself as a historian.
I am.
As well as an artist. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate your stories. I appreciate your references. And that's one of my concerns, especially when you see the flag. You see, I was at a soccer game, or what they call a football game. They had 41 nations from Canada, Central America, and the Caribbean. And if you look at their flags, they resemble the United States flag. It's part of we go. And another thing you were talking about was the paper mache on the guy with the hands out. Mm-hmm. The first thing that came to mind was Roy Ayers, 1973. Red, black, and green. Yeah. If you think about it, you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. And I'm just curious. There was some figures or some things that I remember being in New Orleans and Louisiana, especially in the country. I take it you're a city boy.
Yeah, that was my problem.
And I was thinking of the magnolia trees. Mm-hmm. I was thinking about food, like gumbo. I was thinking about the levees, mm-hmm. the swamp, you mentioned the crawfish. That was my first time seeing those mounds. Yeah. And I remember picking those crawfish up. So I love your visuals, and I do see more. I'd like to see more of your work. I think you're going to be here for another 20 years.
Well, I have a lot of work. That's not the problem.
Just one personal question. I was just curious what your grandkids or your kids call you. They call you Poppy?
No. My grandchildren call me Grandpa.
Okay.
And a couple of years ago, my oldest daughter wanted to call me Willie. I said, no way.
Well, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi.
Where are
I'm
you?
up here.
Over here. Hi.
Okay, I see you now.
I wanted to know, like, seeing the bodies you depicted in your work, they're so symmetrical. I mean, the arms aren't off, they're very realistic. I know you started since you were 13, and I feel like it comes from practice. At this point, do you use rulers or certain, utensils to get the body perfectly symmetrical, or is it just by playing it by ear in a sense? And I also want to know how your grant process, applying for grants and working through them and getting rewarded for them, how that's progressed since the beginning of your career to now.
I'll start with the last one. The last one is the grants, because that's important. The last grant I applied for was the using art as a tool in the transformation of a community. And I applied, and I applied for a $5,000 grant. Now, what I wanted was just to get the grant to get the credibility that what I was doing, if I wanted to, I could apply for another grant. Okay, if you understand. The reality was that they only gave me half the money. And I said, I don't need $2,500. And the person who was responsible for giving the grant, she got angry with me and said, well, we don't even like your work. And I said, well, I'll show you. Because I felt that she was silly, because she was defining art in her terms. And I'm saying, no, babe, what I'm doing goes so far beyond this idea of art, because art is not even a word in any language except English. Other people don't make art. Did we know that? They don't make art. See, so this idea of art, what is art? Art is an expression of who you are. So it becomes real tricky in terms of how we get baited into these ideas of defining things. And once you define them, they already done passed. So now the same young lady, when we did the opening the first time, and there was a beautiful article in the Time-Picayunes on it. It looked like about 100 people came to celebrate the garden because of where we were. And I felt bad for her, but all I could do is go up and give her a hug. Because we all have these moments where we, because of whatever reason, we don't understand and we don't want to understand. And I've become as cynical and as quick-lipped as I am. I still have been a young, ignorant person to understand that people change. So, I give you a hug, babe, and we'll see. But that's not the, so I don't know if I'm answering that part of it. In terms of my figures, I remember, in order to get into graduate school, it's a long story, but because I graduated from Southern University in New Orleans, to get into Maryland Institute, they made me take 18 credits to show that I could play. And yeah, today everybody go, wow. But they really didn't want me in there because they knew the type of work that I was doing. But I wanted to go to Maryland Institute for one main reason, their library. I had never in my life seen an art library that extensive in all my life. Now, Howard University had offered me a full scholarship, but I'd gone to Southern University, so I didn't want to go to Howard because I knew the practice and the art teachers and the people were there. I wanted to find out what this so-called European institution was about. So eventually they had to let me in, although they made me take 18 credits before they would invite. But then when I got in, I just beat them up. That's how you get the Africa Land of Black series. You take all of that and you turn it on its head. And then you say, now deny that. So that's my personality. And my challenge, and I love that. I love turning those contradictions into another sense of reality. So everybody's not me, but uh, uh, I'm not easily discouraged, obviously. But at the same time, I have failures, but I can admit them. You know, I have shortcomings at times, but I can admit them. The key is that my belief in me giving something back is so embedded in my consciousness that the price that those enslaved people paid to stay alive, like putting okra in their hair so that we have food to plant, like the people of Louisiana. My elementary school was named Tomala Fawn. This was a black dude who owned slaves. Okay? My junior high school was named Carter G. Woodson, who is the father of African American history. Too extreme somewhat, but yet for black people to get a school named Carter G. Woodson in New Orleans in 52, because I'm 11 years old, and I realized how hard these folks probably had to work. Those are some bad mojos. They done beat the system. So for me to be less than that effort, I mean, come on, y'all. And that's why I keep, like right now you have a lot of, I've never heard of this many young black kids committing suicide. My generation, that was rare. Now we know that a lot of white kids commit suicide. So what is that about? But black folks committing suicide after you have made that journey and at least you can survive and you can do what you want to do, some of the things you want to do, and you're trying to pass this on to the next generation? Come on. That makes no sense to me that, you decide that, because there's always tomorrow. And with built into the philosophy of New Orleans, that's just a special place. It's all there. So these are the things that I've modeled myself on. And so I never, and I say it honestly, I never had the problem of being by myself. And I think that's important too.
I think we have time for just one more question.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk and conversation. I have a two-part question, one for Aram and then one for you, Mr. Birch. Aram, I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about the process of curating Mr. Birch's work into the totality of the show Together in Time. And then Mr. Birch, I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about going along with the kind of title of the exhibition Together in Time, which you were talking about the kind of future, the futurity of our social relations being based on class rather than race. That's and what that relationship question. Is. And you can take in whatever order.
No.
Well, I can say that I'm one of 5 curators who worked on this exhibition, which was something of an experiment, I think, for the curatorial department and for the museum. But I'd say what it ends up producing, hopefully in like a kind of like interesting way, is that it creates certain kinds of like incongruities rather than trying to like come up with definitive narratives about either what the collection is or what art history is, because this task I think is really difficult for museums. I don't actually understand how it works, and especially if you have like a limited acquisition budget that you're working against, or you're working against other institutions that are much more voracious in their own kind of collecting strategies. So that's like one small part of it in just like the logistical sense, but it was a work that was recently introduced to the collection, and I think collectively we felt we really wanted to kind of honor that and really highlight it as a key acquisition of the last few years. But specifically, I keep going back to this like observational quality of the work and this relationship to television and a certain kind of, you know, pretty extreme violence that's also like depicted in the work, and especially when you're seeing it relative to, you know, other pieces that you showed tonight, and how, you know, it stands apart in some ways, and it's a difficult piece to deal with, I think, in that way, and being able to put that in dialogue with artists that I don't think that you've necessarily shown alongside, but that we might be able to like look at certain kinds of like similarities, but also differences that play out when, you know, you think about this moment in 1988. You're mediating, you know, your experience of being in New Orleans or being in New York at that time.
I was in Brooklyn.
In New York at that time, and, you know, alongside other artists that are also mediating entirely different kinds of worlds and perspectives, but in some ways, like, you know, thinking about television as a conduit for it, with that work in particular.
Yeah. Well, when I heard that the Hammer had purchased that piece, well, the Hammer has another piece of mine too. So they have a print that was donated by Exit Art, I believe, somehow, and that print is also in the Whitney Museum collection. So I just found it interesting that I thought it was a big jump in terms of the piece that they have in the collection. And when I first heard about it, the first thing that hit me was why would they purchase this piece? Because although it's narrative, does the curator think it pertains? This is all it is to this piece, or do they have enough within what they're trying to do to see the double entendres in the piece and the contradictions in the piece? So if there was a chance for a real dialogue where they could talk about what created those environments, that would really enhance another understanding of those kinds of situations. So when I was invited, that gave me another chance to make sure that becomes part of the dialogue. So it took me, 3 months to accept your invitation? But eventually I talked to a few people and I said, okay, man, this may be more important than I think. So I'm here. And you're there, and you are just as inquisitive as I was. And you should be, and hopefully everybody who go and look at that piece. Because on a certain level, as I was telling the chief curator here earlier, that piece is different than anything else out there. That's wonderful. As an artist, you can't miss it. And it's no bigger than that. And you see all of this other stuff which we know, and basically I think can be perceived, not to put any stuff down, more derivative of what we used to be. And yet my piece still fits directly into the dialogue as we have it today, which speaks to the power of the piece, to speak truth to power. So I'm feeling, and most of my work does that, is because they're all based on the moment. That's where I get my inspiration from. That's why I showed you the last ones I've done, is because I'm interested in what I did, but I don't want to come here and show you a bunch of folkloric pieces without you understanding that my journey got another 25 years to it, y'all, and maybe another 5 years, because if there is something that I'm excited about, like right now with the Supreme Court, I'm going to find how to speak to that in a language that speaks about the Supreme Court in 2023 because not in 1989, but so my language has to change because the moment has changed. And so the new language I'm creating is about defining what I'm creating and the knowledge that you have of the creative process that pertains to now. I hope that doesn't sound too complicated. But that's the way my mind runs. I have to create in the moment. And the moment is how inventive can I be to make the similar statements like the one I made with scrubbing and scraping and healing with the one that we see here. They both come through the same strain, but the different incidents made me do different things. Now, I don't know why I do that, but I never followed the rules. I let the work dictate the rules. I was telling somebody earlier, my whole philosophy is that, and it's due to the music, content dictates process. Process does not dictate content. So in New Orleans, when you listen to the music is created out of the suffering and pain of what those people were experiencing. So my art comes out of that same understanding of the creative process. So I don't care where I lecture, and I've taught at Skowhegan, Hunter, and all that stuff. I tell all you young people the same thing, and they become confused initially. But if you are not taking the content that drove you to do that piece and then building a narrative around that speaks to what that piece is about, and then allow that piece to speak for itself, because there will always come that tension where you don't know what you're doing. And you don't have to know, you just have to follow that you're trying to resolve conflict. That's what making art is about. So it's not about you, it's about that piece. So thank you for that question.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mr. Birch. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Have a good evening.
Yeah.
All right. And we'll reconvene upstairs for those who have the energy for it.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you.
Yeah. Wow.